So we've already talked about decimal place values. So again, just as a reminder, if we're thinking of this block as a zoomed in one, this represents one whole. We call this again a tenth because it takes 10 of these pieces to make a whole. We call this a hundredth because it takes 100 of these pieces to make a whole. And we call this a thousandth, our smallest piece, because it takes 1,000 of these pieces to make a whole. So one thing I want to think about today is what would half look like? So we know then that if we have a tenth here, it takes 10 of these pieces to make a whole. So how many would it take to make half of a whole? Well, it would take half of 10, which is 5. So it would take 5 of these pieces to make a half. If we're talking about a hundredth, if we're talking about half of a whole, it would take 100 of these pieces to make a whole. So it would take 50 of these pieces to make half of a whole. And for a thousandth, it would take 500 of these pieces to make half of a whole. Now, if you're wondering, well, why does it take so many of these pieces to make a half? So it takes 500, but it only takes 5 of these. Well, it should visually be clear that this is a lot bigger. This is actually 100 times bigger than a thousandth. So that should be easy to see. Now, one thing I want to start talking about is what would these numbers look like on a number line. So I want to think about a number line for a second that starts at 0 and goes to one whole. So basically, we're looking at anything that's more than nothing and less than one whole. So the largest possible value would be this one whole. So we're really looking and focusing on the tenths, the hundreds, and the thousands because we can't have anything more than one whole. Now, if we're thinking about what would fall on a number line, we want to think about what would fall directly in the middle of 0 and one whole. Well, the number that would fall in between 0 and one whole is half of a whole. And we just said a second ago that we can represent a half as 5 tenths. Again, we had 5 of these. Remember, it takes 10 to make a whole, 10 tenths to make a whole, 5 tenths to make a half. We could also say, if we used a little smaller pieces, we could say 50 hundredths, or, and if you want to see 50 hundredths, would be 100 hundredths make a whole, 50 hundredths make a half, or we could also have 1,000 thousandths make a whole, so 500 thousandths make a half. So these three numbers right here are equivalent. These three numbers are equivalent. Now, one thing I want to get in the habit of is realizing if this is a half, we can kind of look at every decimal as more than one half and less than one half. So I'll give you an example. If we were to look at the decimal, this decimal right here, which is 3 tenths, I would know that 3 tenths is less than a half. So I would then say that 3 tenths has to fall somewhere between 0 and 1 half because 5 tenths is half and 3 tenths is less than that. So I would say 3 tenths is between 0 and a half. It's 3 tenths away from 0. It's 2 tenths away from a half. So I would say it's a little closer to a half. So I would put 3 tenths on my number line. On the other side, if I were to say something like this, I would read this number as 0 and 75 hundredths. I look here in the center and I can see, well, 50 hundredths are half. That means 75 hundredths must be more than half. So we know it's going to fall between half and a whole. And actually, 75 falls directly in between 50 and 100. So we would say 75 hundredths falls here. We could do the same thing if we looked up a thousandths decimal. So let's say we had an example like this. 307 thousandths, we'd say, is it more than half or less than half? Well, we know that 500 thousandths is half, so 307 is less than that. So it's going to fall somewhere between 0 and a half. And you're going to notice it's pretty similar to this number here. We put down 3 tenths. One easy thing that we can do is we can say that 3 tenths, and we can actually see this visually. If I had 3 tenths, that would be the same as it takes 100 of these to make a tenth. So that would be 100, 200, 300 of those. So 3/10 is the same thing as, you can just add 2 zeros here, as 300 thousandths. So 307 thousandths would just be slightly bigger than that. Now, we can start to think about this number line where we can put decimals, and we can start to order decimals from smallest, closest to 0 over here, to biggest, closest to 1 over here. And what we're going to be talking about is how can we discover and how can we figure out exactly where different numbers are going to fall on our number line.